Hello, my name is Amy Natsky. Welcome to my channel. For the past several months I've been discussing Christian mysticism. In the last video I talked about approaching the writings of the mystics, and today I want to emphasize the importance and the gift of understanding them in the context of their own lives. Just to be clear, when we refer to a mystic generally and traditionally, we could be talking about anyone who's seeking transcendent union with God, or the absolute, and they do that according to a specific framework of belief or narrative of reality. The Christian mystic is oriented in the Christian narrative of reality, and in that narrative, union with God happens through trust in the person of Jesus Christ, and then through the transforming work of the Holy Spirit as He comes in the power of Christ's resurrection. It will be the Christian mystics that I'm talking about here. The mystics are driven. This union with God is the central focus of their lives, and they come to pursue it above everything else. But knowing much about the mystics can be tricky. It takes extra work. That's because it's the interior dimension of their lives where the main action is. It's the domain of the heart and the will and the mind. The mystics value this inner life in such a way, and they're preoccupied with it in such a way, that as we read their writings generally, we find a conspicuous lack of detail about their external scenarios. We don't know, for instance, how old they are as they write, or what social class they may have come from, or even when they're writing or where they are as they write. We don't get a good view of the particular conditions and trials that shape them and really serve as the grist of their spiritual life. So it's fitting for us to be very curious. My favorite example is Julian of Norwich, who wrote the famous Revelations of Divine Love. She was born in 1443 in England in a very tumultuous time, but she doesn't tell us about the tumult. She doesn't say anything about the peasants' revolt, or the papal schism, or the bubonic plague which ravished her hometown in her lifetime. What she does tell us, early in her account, is that in her youth, before the gift of those visions, she had asked God for three things. She asked first to have a deeper understanding of Christ's crucifixion. Second, to experience a nearly fatal sickness so that she could suffer with Him and for Him. And third, she asked for three wounds. The first was the wound of true contrition, then the wound of compassion, and finally, the wound of longing for God. She tells us that it was this last desire that was constantly with her. She did not want to lose her fervency for God. This is fascinating. There had to have been something very dramatic happening in the background earlier in her life, something that shaped her into the person who would ask these particular things of God, because those aren't normal things to ask of God. Some scholars suspect now that she lost a baby and a husband in the plague, and this is believable, as it came right through her hometown there. But she herself never mentions it. In fact, she doesn't even tell us her own name. We call her Julian because after the visions, she became an anchoress at a church called St. Julian's in the city of Norwich. Another example would be the legendary St. Francis of Assisi. He tells us almost nothing himself of his early life. He doesn't write very much at all. But it was his earlier companions and then those within the Franciscan orders who preserved his legacy. And they are the ones who tell us the story about his being the spoiled son of a wealthy merchant and how he loved the high life and all those sort of juicy details. So as we read the mystics, we must remember that they were steeped in and subject to time and place in all the same particularity that we ourselves know. Then we do our own research to get as close as we can to those details. The internet makes this quite easy, but I urge you to collect from lots of sources. Visit the monastery bookstores. Search for rare book sites. Look for religious publishing houses from different traditions within the Christian church. And look for what was said about the mystics at different times in history. Lots of people have wanted to speak for them. They'll be represented differently according to who's presenting the material. One of the best sources is the specific religious orders that they may have been affiliated with. See what is being published by scholars within those orders today. Those scholars are going to be very close to original source material, and they'll want to do very well by them. For example, if you're interested in TERESA of Avila, or Thérèse of Lisieux, or Ruth Burrows, look to the Carmelites. If you're interested in St. Francis, look to the Franciscans, and to the Dominicans for Meister Eckhart. And Meister Eckhart does need to be understood in context. I would recommend, at least in the beginning, to stay away from sources that appeal to mysticism in itself as the primary draw, as if mysticism or being a mystic is what's fascinating the author or the content creator. Not that we want to disown those words. I don't mean that. But I suggest this because the Christian mystics were not invested in mysticism in itself. They were invested in the triune God. They were invested in that experiential knowledge of Jesus Christ. And once you really read their own words, this will speak for itself clearly. But it doesn't always shine through just any biographical material. Here are some questions to ask as you're beginning to explore. First, what was the state of the world? What was our mystic in the midst of by being alive when and where they were? And what was going on in the church? Remember, there was always drama happening in the church. What were the dynamics at the time between different parts of the church? And who would our mystic have been reading or hearing? Who were the people who were influencing them one way or another, and can we find out about them too? Who might they have been in open disagreement with? What immediate secular or political situations were they folded up inside of? And here's something of an example. Consider how Francois Fenelon and Madame Guyon both were in the aristocratic circle that moved around Louis XIV. This was early in the Enlightenment, when people were just beginning to objectify the reality of the self. We can wonder how having to contend over the years with the incredible narcissism of Louis XIV might have influenced their own outlook and their language as they write about the dynamics between the self and God. I like to think about that one. Now, if you can, try to discern also the weaknesses of the person you're exploring, their foibles, their unique needs as people. Don't be afraid of seeing them as deeply flawed. And remember that just as for us, these are the things that set them up to seek God and then discover Him to be filled with grace. These kinds of nitty-gritty details can be hard to come by. The earliest biographers of the mystics and saints don't like to draw attention to the darker side of their subject, so we often have to read between the lines. But those complexities and those foibles are always there in the background. Now remember that some of the mystics were persecuted for what they wrote and had to stand trial. I'm thinking of Madame Guyon again, or Meister Eckhart, or some of the Beguine mystics. So we want to know what happened at those trials. How did our defendant represent themselves? How close can we get to knowing what was really going on? Don't automatically be dismayed when you hear about charges of heresy, but go in and look and see what happened, and ask, why do their works live on even when they were charged with heresy? Why is it that these writings are still being read today, and are they still considered heretical? The most important questions to ask, I think, at this juncture are first, who was God to them? And second, how do they understand themselves before God? Because most of the time, if not all of the time, these are the questions that were driving them in whatever was getting them into trouble. Again, above all, read their own writing. Always let the mystics speak for themselves on their terms. What is it that they most want to say? So in closing, studying the lives of the mystics can be a great added gift to us in addition to their writing. But as I said, we have to do that extra work. and I have an illustration for this. Think of the mystics as trees. They're thriving, majestic, beautiful trees, all different from each other, differently beautiful, and each tree is abundant with fruit. But these trees are always located right at the place where they meet the mercy of God. Literally, they are anchored and rooted in the river of living water, which is Jesus Christ himself. And this is the same place where they are known by God fully in all of their personality and precisely in all of their condition, all of their need, all of their poverty. So if we want to get that whole picture, it won't happen through hearsay or just reading their writing. We have to get up and see if we can find that tree where it is growing right there along the river. So I'll finish with that. Thank you for listening. Please consider clicking on the like and the subscribe, and I'll see you next time.